Dan Orville says, you learned how to properly handle a whip in what I believe was the Indiana Jones episode of Mythbusters. How difficult was the learning process? It looked like you really enjoyed it. Dude, dressing as Indy every day for 2 weeks, just one of the best shoots of my life. The most fun. And I did get some wonderful deep instruction from whip master Anthony DeLongis about how to use Indy's bullwhip correctly. It's worth telling you a little bit of my history with whips and whip making, because like the whip has always fascinated me as an object. I didn't understand it for the longest time. When I was a little kid, I had this book called something like The World. And it was a bunch of short stories about the world. It was like one of these, I don't know. I wish I could find it again because it was like one of those books that kids have that's just like information about stuff and short stories. And there was some short story about an American kid in a foreign land meeting a kid who's a local who makes whips, and he trades him a toy for a whip. And I thought, it was just the first time I realized that people made whips. I know that seems obvious, but it's like, when you realize someone makes something, it begs the next question, which is how. And then Raiders came out, and when I was 14 years old, 14, 15 years, the sweet spot. I was in the sweet spot of an age to watch Raiders. And Indy's whip, it's just an amazing, amazing convention. There's this lovely moment, tangent, you can download the transcript of Spielberg, Lucas, and Lawrence Kasdan talking through the plot of Raiders for the very first time. They talked for several hours, and that transcript is something you can go find online, and it's fascinating to read. Young Spielberg, young Lucas, young Larry Kasdan. And one of the things I loved about the discussion was how surprising some of the approaches were. When George is the first one to say, I think, we're talking of a sort of Charlton Heston type from this movie, and maybe he's got a different kind of weapon, like he carries a whip. And Spielberg goes, yeah, whip is great, and maybe he could use it to like lasso the girl and bring her to him. And George immediately says, no, you never use the weapon on the girl. If it's an object meant for offense, you don't use it for anything else. And I was like, that's a fascinating clarity to have at that age, at that stage of his life. I just loved that. Anyway, I saw Raiders and became obsessed with the Raiders whip forever. And back in the mid-90s, I had a shop space on Bartlett Street here in San Francisco, here in the Mission District. And a friend of mine would visit town from MIT every year for like the summer, and we would do projects together. And one year he was like, I want to try whip making. And no, that's not how that began. I built my first whip without anybody else. Right. I was at Tandy Leather, and there was this little paper book on whip making, and I bought it. And I went to S.H. Frank Leathers here in the Mission, and I bought a Latigo, 7-ounce Latigo hide, and I made a whip out of that hide. And it's not beautiful. That whip still exists. It's not beautiful, but I learned a lot. There were some things that I didn't quite understand, like in a whip, there's a center core of usually four laces. Then you go over that with a core of 6 laces. And each of these laces is cut to taper so that you're reducing the mass of the thing slowly as you knot these strands together. And then after you have the 4-strand and the 6-strand, that's a 2-belly whip, which the Raiders whip is. I might be getting some of these terms wrong, I apologize. And you cover over that with a triangular piece of leather. And in the Tandy Leather book, they just cut this long triangle and then started knotting around it. And I was trying to do that. It was so hard. I used some cat gut to hold the triangle all the way up. And then I braided I think an 8-plate braid over that. And like I said, the whip isn't beautiful, but it does operate as a whip. It does function. And I gave it to my buddy Davey. And Davey ended up, years later, what happened? Oh, wow, right. He lived in the same building as his landlord, and he had submitted rent, and then something happened and his bank account got frozen, and he needed to remove the rent check he'd slid under his landlord's door before it would overdraft his account. He just needed like 2 days, and it was like just far enough that he couldn't get to it, and he used my whip and was able to like snake it under the door and like boop, and like pull his envelope back. So the first whip I did actually was able to execute a cool mission. But once I had this Latigo whip, and this is long before I gave it to Davey, I wanted to make a real kangaroo hide whip. I had done enough research to know that the Raiders whips are made out of kangaroo hide, the strongest leather there is. And back then in the mid-90s, there was only one national importer of kangaroo hide, and it happened to be David Morgan, who built the whips for Raiders. And I called them. I was like looking at their website, and I was thinking about this hide, and I was like, I feel like I just don't know enough. So I called them, and they picked up the phone, and I said, hey, I'm a dude in San Francisco. I'm making a whip, and I'd love some advice. And David Morgan got on the phone and talked to me for the better part of an hour. Was so generous with his time. And I also happen to know that David Morgan didn't have a high opinion of the fetishists, the people who use whips for reasons other than horsemanship or farming. He didn't have a high opinion of that crowd, and I know that like some of those folks had posted online that they got hung up on, and I don't love that. I will say, couldn't have been more generous with me. And when we did the Raiders episode, his son Ron built the whips for that episode, and they couldn't have been more lovely collaborators with us. And Morgan actually even told me, oh, what you did with the triangular bolster, yes, that is a regular thing that people do. And he gave me some other little hints. And then he said, I will pick out a hide for you and we'll send you an invoice. And I built my first whip out of kangaroo hide, which I still have. I meant to go get it this morning, but I had forgotten my keys and I ran out of time. But it is a 12-plate, 2-belly whip. It is 10 feet long. It's ridiculous. It's so fat and it's magnificent, but you need hearing protection when you crack it, as I learned. And it's also kind of difficult to find a safe place to crack a whip in San Francisco. I went to Dolores Park and cracking it, and very soon somebody comes up and they're like, I really want to talk to you about your whip. And as they get closer, I can see they're wearing a dog collar that's just visible underneath their cardigan. And you know, it's a local San Francisco freaky deaky. So you meet all sorts of people. And then I went down to the Embarcadero because there's that big field among the Embarcadero buildings. And I was cracking that, and that sounded great. The echoes of the whip cracks echoing off the Embarcadero buildings. And then the police showed up because someone reported gunshots. Those are all my whip stories leading up to getting on set for the Mythbusters Indiana Jones episode and having Anthony DeLongis not only show me how to properly crack a whip, and it's always this lesson that less is more, that you think that cracking a whip is this like, that you do this thing like you do with a towel, and the amount of energy you expend is such a fraction of what you think. Because a whip is nothing but a wave magnifier. Right, you start a wave with this thick part that as the whip gets thinner, the amount of energy it no longer has to expend moving its own flesh, it expends moving faster. And so that speed increases exponentially out into the end. Oh, right. And that's the same episode that we actually caught the end of the whip breaking the speed of sound for the high-speed camera. I have one more whip story. That was a difficult thing to do. And by the way, every whip crack isn't necessarily a breaking of the sound barrier. We found you can get a healthy crack below the sound barrier, but boy, can you tell once you've done it a bunch, you can really tell the ones that have broken the sound barrier. So just for reference, we had this high-end, very repeatable, fast-operating, high-speed camera that filmed thousands of frames per second. We shot a wide shot to figure out where the whip was actually cracking over a grid. Then we zoomed in on that part of the grid. And after a full day of testing, we were able to get it. But it was non-trivial, not simple. And then in part of my whip research, I had been corresponding with Neil Stevenson, who had done a deep dive into whip cracking for the mechanism, the whip mechanism from Seven Eves. I won't get into the weeds on that. If you haven't read Seven Eves, just read it. It's a really spectacular science fiction book. Just one of my favorite books. And when Neil Stevenson does research into something, man, everybody else step back, because he goes all the way down the rabbit hole. And he found this Frenchman. I wonder if I can find it here, if I can find the name. Carrière, 1927. A Frenchman named Carrière was able to definitively prove that a whip broke the speed of sound and get a photo of it happening in 1927 using like fired flash units and not quite a wet plate photography setup, but like film was still pretty new. It's a beautiful, beautiful story of Carrière understanding that whips break the speed of sound. It's a story for another time, but that was a great addition to my knowledge base about doing the Raiders episode. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I wanted to briefly mention that you could become a tested member. I know, everybody is competing for you to become a member of their thing. What I want to express to you is that the Tested membership has become such an important part of the Tested family. We get tremendous feedback from the Tested members, and they expand the stories that we can tell and the things that we have access to. And you can become a part of it right now by clicking on the link below. See you in the chat.